The platinum card slammed against the counter. Declined. Grace Mitchell's breath caught. The teenage cashier winced, shaking his head as whispers erupted behind her. 30 executives waited for her call in 20 minutes. A $4 coffee had just shattered her composure. Weathered hands slid crisp bills across the marble surface. She spun around. A man in a worn flannel shirt stood there, his daughter's tiny fingers wrapped around his neck, both watching her with eyes that held secrets. No pity, no judgment, just recognition that made her chest tighten. His calloused palm bore a scar that caught the morning light, a jagged line that seemed familiar, like a half-remembered dream. "Keep the change," he murmured, turning away before she could speak. The little girl waved over his shoulder, her smile innocent and knowing all at once. Grace stared at their retreating figures, her heart hammering against her ribs. Something about him whispered of unfinished stories and debts that could never be repaid. Grace Mitchell had built her empire on precision. Every contract signed, every merger executed, every competitor eliminated with surgical accuracy. At 35, she commanded Mitchell Architectural Designs from the 42nd floor of downtown's gleaming tower, her signature on buildings that stretched across 3 states. Yet standing in Miller's coffee house, watching steam curl from her forgotten latte, she felt something crack inside her chest. The stranger's flannel shirt had been faded navy blue, soft around the edges like a well-loved blanket. His daughter couldn't have been older than 5, all bright eyes and tangled auburn hair that caught the morning light streaming through rain-spotted windows. Grace pressed her fingers against the warm ceramic mug, trying to steady the tremor that had nothing to do with caffeine withdrawal. The quarterly board meeting that morning passed in a blur of projected earnings and strategic expansions. Grace nodded at appropriate intervals, signed documents with practiced efficiency, but her mind kept drifting to calloused hands and knowing eyes. She'd built walls around herself so high that genuine kindness felt foreign, almost dangerous. When her assistant reminded her about the 3 o'clock conference call with investors from Seattle, Grace surprised herself by declining. Instead, she found herself walking back toward Miller's coffee house, her heels clicking against wet pavement like a countdown. The afternoon crowd was thinner, mostly college students hunched over laptops and elderly couples sharing newspapers. Grace ordered another latte and settled by the window, watching for a flash of navy flannel that never came. 3 days passed before she saw him again. Tuesday morning brought another wave of financial chaos, her company's overseas accounts frozen due to a banking error that would take weeks to resolve. Grace stood at the same counter, her backup credit cards maxed from recent equipment purchases, counting crumpled bills from her purse like a college student scraping together textbook money. The familiar weight of eyes on her back made her shoulders tense. She turned to find the same man approaching, his daughter skipping beside him in rain boots decorated with cartoon elephants. "Rough week?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that made her forget about board meetings and profit margins. His name was Cole Bennett, she learned, and his daughter Ruby had just turned 5 last month. They lived 6 blocks away in a converted warehouse that Cole had renovated himself. Ruby tugged on Grace's designer coat with paint-stained fingers, chattering about the treehouse her daddy was building in their tiny backyard. "It's going to have windows and everything, and Daddy says I can paint it any color I want, even purple with yellow polka dots if that makes me happy." Grace found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. Cole's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, deep lines that spoke of genuine joy rather than corporate politeness. He worked with his hands, she discovered, crafting custom furniture from reclaimed wood. There was sawdust under his fingernails, and a patience in his movements that made Grace wonder when she'd last created something beautiful instead of merely profitable. When Ruby asked if Grace had any children, the question hit like a physical blow, unexpected and sharp. The conversation flowed easier than Grace expected, punctuated by Ruby's innocent observations about why grown-ups always looked so serious. Cole listened more than he spoke, his attention focused and unhurried in a way that made Grace feel seen rather than evaluated. She found herself mentioning the stress of running a company, the weight of decisions that affected hundreds of employees, the loneliness of success that nobody warned you about. Cole nodded without offering empty platitudes or unsolicited advice. Instead, he shared stories about Ruby's attempts to help with his woodworking projects, disasters that had resulted in laughter rather than frustration. When Grace's phone buzzed with urgent messages from her office, she ignored them for the first time in her career. The world wouldn't end if she took an hour to remember what conversation felt like. Cole's workshop occupied the ground floor of their converted warehouse, filled with the rich scent of cedar and pine. Grace had followed them home after Ruby insisted on showing her the half-finished treehouse, her usual caution overridden by genuine curiosity. Handcrafted furniture lined the walls, tables with grain patterns that flowed like rivers, chairs curved to embrace the human form, cabinets that seemed to grow from the wood itself rather than being imposed upon it. But it was the architectural drawings tucked between lumber stacks that made Grace's breath catch. Detailed blueprints for affordable housing projects, innovative designs that maximized space and light while minimizing cost. These weren't the work of a simple carpenter. Cole's fingers had traced the lines with unconscious pride before quickly rolling the papers away, but not before Grace glimpsed a signature that made her pulse quicken. The drawings bore the mark of C. Bennett, the architect whose innovative low-income housing design had won the National Design Competition 5 years ago. Grace remembered the project vividly. She'd placed second, her proposal deemed technically superior, but lacking the human warmth that had made Bennett's design legendary. The winner had never claimed his prize, never built the planned community, simply vanished from the architectural world without explanation. Now she understood why. Cole's wife Sarah had died 3 years ago, cancer that had eaten away their savings and his faith in grand gestures. He'd traded blueprints for lumber, skyscrapers for tree houses, because Ruby needed a father more than the world needed another celebrated architect. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that success could be measured in different currencies. Ruby's bedtime ritual included 3 stories, 2 glasses of water, and a comprehensive review of the day's adventures. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway as Cole navigated each request with infinite patience, his large hands gentle as he tucked blankets around his daughter's small form. "Daddy, is the pretty lady going to come back tomorrow?" Ruby asked, her voice heavy with approaching sleep. Cole's eyes found Grace's across the room, a question flickering in their depths. "I don't know, sweetheart, but if she does, we'll be glad to see her." The simple honesty of his answer made Grace's throat tight. She'd spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from her: contracts, connections, capital. Cole wanted nothing except perhaps her company, and the novelty of that desire felt almost revolutionary. Grace began returning to Miller's Coffee House every Tuesday and Thursday morning, telling herself it was merely a change of routine. Cole and Ruby became fixtures in her suddenly unpredictable schedule, their easy warmth a counterbalance to the cold efficiency of her corporate world. Ruby's questions were endlessly entertaining. Why did Grace's car talk when she put it in reverse? Whether fish got thirsty? If rich people's ice cream tasted different than regular ice cream? Cole's answers were thoughtful and honest, never condescending, always encouraging Ruby's curiosity about the world around her. Grace found herself looking forward to these conversations more than board meetings, their laughter more rewarding than quarterly profit reports. She began bringing small gifts, art supplies for Ruby, specialty coffee beans for Cole, gestures that felt natural rather than calculated. The day Grace's world cracked open began like any other Tuesday. She'd arrived at Miller's Coffee House early, claiming her usual table by the window, when a black sedan pulled up outside. The man who emerged wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the morning drizzle. Charles Mitchell had flown in from New York unannounced, his presence in their small Oregon town as jarring as a thunderclap in clear sky. Grace's stomach dropped as she watched her adoptive father scan the coffee shop's interior, his pale eyes settling on her with cold disapproval. 20 years of carefully maintained distance evaporated in an instant. Charles had built his fortune on the principle that weakness was contagious, emotion a luxury that successful people couldn't afford. Playing house with the locals, Grace. Charles settled into the chair across from her without invitation, his voice carrying the particular chill reserved for profound disappointment. He'd discovered her recent absences from the office, the delayed contract signings, the unprecedented gaps in her previously flawless schedule. His private investigator had been thorough. Photographs of Grace laughing with Cole and Ruby, evidence of her descent into what Charles termed sentimental foolishness. The conversation that followed stripped away years of careful professional distance, revealing the transactional nature of their relationship with brutal clarity. Charles hadn't adopted Grace out of paternal love, but as an investment in his legacy, a successor who would carry forward his empire with appropriate ruthlessness. Her recent behavior threatened that investment, and threats to Charles Mitchell's interests were eliminated swiftly and without mercy. The photographs spread across the table like playing cards in a high-stakes game. Cole lifting Ruby onto his shoulders outside the coffee shop, Grace kneeling in sawdust, helping Ruby paint a dollhouse. The three of them walking toward Cole's workshop, looking for all the world like a family. Charles's voice remained level as he dissected each image, explaining how Grace's association with working-class nobodies would undermine her credibility with investors, damage the company's reputation, destroy everything they'd built together. But it was his final revelation that made Grace's blood freeze in her veins. 20 years ago, when Grace was 15 and Charles's newest ward, a tragic accident had nearly ended her life before it truly began. A drunk driver running a red light, a man who'd thrown himself into traffic to push a teenager to safety, a hero who'd died so that Grace Mitchell could live to disappoint her adoptive father with inconvenient displays of humanity. Cole's father had been a carpenter, working late on a downtown renovation project when he'd seen the speeding car, the girl frozen in the crosswalk, the split-second decision that would cost him everything. Thomas Bennett had died instantly, leaving behind a 15-year-old son who'd grown up believing his father had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Charles had ensured the incident was handled quietly, the Bennett family compensated through anonymous channels, Grace's involvement buried beneath layers of legal documentation and non-disclosure agreements. She'd never known the name of her savior, never understood why nightmares of screeching tires and shouting voices haunted her sleep. Charles had considered it an unnecessary burden, trauma that might interfere with Grace's development into the perfect corporate successor. Now, watching Cole approach through the coffee shop window with Ruby dancing beside him, Grace understood the true weight of the debt she could never repay. Cole's face changed when he saw Charles, wariness replacing warmth as he recognized the predator sitting across from Grace. Years of being dismissed by men in expensive suits had taught him to read the signs. The calculating gaze, the territorial positioning, the way Charles's presence seemed to shrink Grace into herself. Ruby's cheerful greeting died on her lips as she sensed the tension radiating from the adults around her. "Grace, we should go," Cole said quietly, his hand protective on his daughter's shoulder. But Charles wasn't finished delivering his ultimatum. The choice was simple, he explained with clinical precision. Grace could return to New York immediately, cut all contact with her working-class distractions, and resume her responsibilities as Mitchell Architectural Designs' CEO. Or she could continue playing at poverty tourism and watch her adoptive father dismantle everything she'd worked to build, starting with the jobs of her 300 employees. The silence that followed felt like drowning. Grace stared at her hands, manicured nails that had never known sawdust or paint stains, fingers that signed contracts but had never built anything lasting. Cole's confusion was evident. Who was this man who spoke to Grace like a disobedient child? Why did her face look like a mask had slipped back into place? What secrets lay behind the walls she'd suddenly rebuilt around herself? Ruby tugged on Grace's sleeve with innocent persistence, asking why everyone looked so sad, whether they could still see the treehouse tomorrow. The little girl's trust felt like a knife between Grace's ribs. She'd allowed herself to believe that kindness could exist without conditions, that acceptance didn't require performance, that love might be given freely rather than earned through achievement. Charles's smile was razor-thin as he watched Grace's internal calculations, recognizing the moment when duty would triumph over desire. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered, the words directed at Ruby but meant for Cole. She couldn't explain about debts that transcended money, about the weight of knowing that her existence had cost a father his life, about the impossible choice between personal happiness and collective responsibility. Charles had played his hand perfectly, weaponizing Grace's guilt and her sense of obligation to the employees who depended on her decisions. She stood on unsteady legs, her designer heels clicking against hardwood like a countdown to execution. Cole's eyes followed her movement, comprehension dawning slowly as he realized this was goodbye. The man who'd once sacrificed architectural fame for his daughter's well-being understood the terrible mathematics of impossible choices. He didn't try to stop her, didn't demand explanations that would only cause more pain. Instead, he lifted Ruby into his arms and walked away, leaving Grace to face the consequences of a salvation she'd never asked for. The days that followed blurred together like scenes from someone else's life. Grace returned to her penthouse apartment, her corner office, her carefully orchestrated existence of meetings and mergers and strategic decisions. Charles monitored her schedule with paternal satisfaction, pleased to see his investment back on track. The Mitchell Architectural Design staff welcomed their CEO's return from her brief sabbatical, nobody questioning the dark circles under her eyes or the way she flinched at the sound of children's laughter echoing from the daycare center across the street. Grace threw herself into work with desperate intensity, approving projects and acquiring smaller firms with the mechanical precision of a machine designed for efficiency rather than joy. But at night, alone in her glass tower above the city, she dreamed of sawdust and paint-stained fingers, of Ruby's innocent questions and Cole's patient answers. The accident happened on a Thursday. Grace was reviewing contracts when her assistant's panicked voice crackled through the intercom. Cole Bennett had been rushed to Portland General Hospital after a construction beam had collapsed at a job site. The drive from downtown to the hospital passed in a haze of traffic lights and mounting dread. Grace found Ruby in the pediatric waiting room, small and lost in a chair too big for her body, clutching a wooden elephant that Cole had carved from maple. The little girl's face lit up when she saw Grace, arms reaching out with complete trust despite weeks of abandonment. "Daddy got hurt," Ruby whispered against Grace's shoulder, her voice thick with tears. "But he's going to be okay, right? You wouldn't let anything happen to him, would you?" The faith in those words was devastating. Cole's injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. Broken ribs, a concussion, and a severely damaged left hand that would require surgery and months of physical therapy. Grace sat beside his hospital bed while he slept, studying the bandages that covered his skilled carpenter's fingers, wondering if he'd ever again be able to create the beautiful things that gave his life meaning. Ruby had fallen asleep curled against Grace's side, her warm weight a reminder of the family Grace had walked away from to preserve her adoptive father's empire. When Cole's eyes finally opened, finding Grace's face in the dim hospital lighting, his first words weren't questions about his injuries or concerns about his livelihood. "You came back," he said simply, wonder and relief mingling in his voice, as if Grace's presence was the most natural thing in the world. The truth spilled out of Grace like water from a broken dam. 20 years of guilt and carefully maintained ignorance, the weight of knowing that Cole's father had died to save her life, Charles's manipulation and ultimatums, and the impossible choice between personal happiness and collective responsibility. Cole listened without interruption, his good hand finding hers somewhere in the middle of her confession, thumb tracing patterns across her knuckles that spoke of forgiveness before she'd finished asking for it. "My father saved you because that's who he was," Cole said when Grace's voice finally broke. "He would have done the same for any stranger in danger. You don't owe him guilt, Grace. You owe him a life well lived." The simplicity of that truth was both liberating and terrifying, permission to stop paying for a debt that had never truly existed. Ruby stirred against Grace's shoulder, mumbling sleepy questions about when Daddy could come home and whether Grace would stay for dinner tomorrow, and if they could finally finish painting the treehouse purple with yellow polka dots. The little girl's assumptions about Grace's permanent return to their lives felt like hope and fear tangled together, possibility and responsibility intertwined beyond separation. Cole's eyes held questions he was too patient to voice. Whether Grace had truly chosen them over her corporate empire, what sacrifices she was willing to make for a love that offered no guarantees, if she understood that choosing him meant choosing a smaller life, but perhaps a fuller one. Grace thought about the 300 employees whose jobs depended on her decisions, the board members who trusted her leadership, the empire that Charles had built with her as its intended inheritor. The answer came not in words, but in action. Grace called her assistant from Cole's hospital room, dictating her resignation letter with quiet conviction, while Ruby built block towers on the floor, and Cole watched with growing amazement. Mitchell Architectural Designs would survive her departure. The company's foundation was stronger than any single person, its talented staff capable of continued success under new leadership. Charles would be furious, probably vindictive, certainly determined to make Grace's transition as difficult as possible. But sitting in that hospital room, surrounded by the people who loved her without conditions or calculations, Grace finally understood the difference between existing and living. She chose living, with all its uncertainties and small joys and daily miracles that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. 6 months later, Grace stood in the doorway of Bennett & Associates Architectural Design, watching Cole explain the principles of sustainable construction to a group of local college students. His left hand still bore scars from the accident, fingers that moved carefully but precisely as he sketched design concepts on recycled paper. Their small firm specialized in affordable housing and community projects, work that paid modestly but filled the soul in ways that corporate contracts never could. Ruby had appointed herself office manager, her desk equipped with crayons and graph paper, where she designed houses for families of rabbits and bears and other creatures that needed homes built with imagination rather than profit margins. The purple and yellow polka-dotted treehouse in their backyard had become legendary among the neighborhood children, proof that dreams could be built with hammer and nails and unlimited patience. Grace's own transformation had been less visible, but no less profound. Her wardrobe now included jeans and work boots alongside designer suits, her manicured nails often stained with paint or soil from Ruby's garden projects. She'd discovered talents she never knew she possessed, an eye for color and texture that translated beautifully to interior design, a gift for seeing the potential in neglected spaces that others dismissed as hopeless. The three of them had become a family through daily choices rather than legal documents, bound together by shared meals and bedtime stories and the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful from the ground up. Charles had cut off all financial support, as promised, but Grace found that freedom from his expectations was worth any price. The evening routine had evolved into ritual. Cole would finish his sketches while Grace helped Ruby with homework that mostly involved creative writing about adventures in magical forests. Dinner was simple but shared, conversations flowing from Ruby's school day to Grace's latest project, to Cole's plans for expanding their small business. After Ruby was asleep, Grace and Cole would sit on their front porch, watching neighbors walk their dogs and teenagers race bicycles down the quiet street. Sometimes they talked about the future, the community center they hoped to design, the scholarship fund they wanted to establish in Thomas Bennett's name, the possibility of expanding their family. More often they simply enjoyed the silence, hands intertwined and hearts at peace with choices that prioritized love over ambition. Ruby's 8th birthday party was held in their backyard, the now famous treehouse serving as headquarters for a treasure hunt that had the neighborhood children searching for hidden clues among Grace's flower beds. Cole had built a wooden swing that hung from the old oak tree, its arc carrying riders high enough to see over the fence into the community garden that Grace had helped establish on the vacant lot next door. The cake was homemade rather than professionally decorated, Ruby's friends more interested in the fort-building contest than fancy party favors. Grace watched from the kitchen window as Cole pushed child after child on the swing, his laughter mixing with theirs in harmonies that spoke of joy freely given and received. This was wealth that couldn't be measured in profit margins or market share, success that existed in moments of connection rather than quarterly earnings reports. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by Charles's private courier with the formal language of legal documents and corporate dissolution. Mitchell Architectural Designs had been sold to a competitor, Grace's former employees absorbed into the larger firm with generous severance packages and retained positions. Charles's final gift, or curse, was ensuring that Grace's decision to leave wouldn't result in others paying the price for her choices. The message was clear. Their relationship was permanently severed, her inheritance revoked. Her name struck from the family records with surgical precision. Grace read the documents twice before folding them carefully and placing them in the drawer where she kept Ruby's artwork and Cole's love letters, transforming legal rejection into evidence of freedom finally achieved. That evening, as Grace tucked Ruby into bed beneath blankets hand-sewn by Mrs. Henderson from next door, the little girl asked one of her wonderfully complicated questions. "Mama Grace, do you ever miss being important?" The title had evolved naturally over the months, Ruby's need for a mother figure gradually acknowledged and accepted by all three members of their unconventional family. Grace considered the question seriously, thinking about corner offices and first-class flights and the intoxicating rush of closing million-dollar deals. "I'm still important, sweetheart," she said finally, "just to different people, in different ways." Ruby nodded sagely, as if this explanation made perfect sense, then launched into detailed plans for tomorrow's adventure involving bicycle races and sidewalk chalk murals. The small wooden box sat on Grace's nightstand, its surface worn smooth by 20 years of careful handling. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, lay a man's wristwatch, steel and leather, practical rather than precious, stopped forever at 3:47 on a spring afternoon when time had ended for Thomas Bennett. Charles had returned it with the legal documents, perhaps as cruelty or perhaps as closure, the final piece of a puzzle Grace had never known she was solving. The watch would go to Ruby someday, along with stories about the grandfather who died before she was born, the man whose sacrifice had made their family possible in ways he could never have imagined. Grace traced the watch face with one finger, whispering thanks to a stranger who'd become the foundation of everything she held dear. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing their neighborhood in snow that transformed ordinary houses into fairy tale cottages and turned Ruby's backyard into a wonderland of sledding hills and snow angel competitions. Grace and Cole worked together to winterize the treehouse, installing battery-powered lights and thermal blankets that would keep Ruby's outdoor adventures comfortable even in freezing weather. Their business had grown steady and strong, word-of-mouth referrals bringing projects that challenged their creativity, while serving families who needed homes more than showpieces. Grace's architectural background blended seamlessly with Cole's construction expertise, their different perspectives creating designs that were both beautiful and practical, innovative, yet grounded in human needs rather than artistic ego. Christmas morning found them around a tree that Cole and Ruby had cut themselves from the tree farm outside town, its asymmetrical branches decorated with ornaments that told the story of their unconventional family. Ruby's handmade gifts included painted rocks for the garden, a birdhouse assembled with more enthusiasm than precision, and a drawing of their house with stick figures labeled Daddy, Mama Grace, and Ruby standing beneath a rainbow that stretched across the entire page. Grace's presents to Cole included new tools for his workshop and a leather journal for sketching design ideas, while Cole surprised Grace with a custom-built easel and a set of watercolor paints for the artistic pursuits she'd rediscovered after years of corporate tunnel vision. Their gifts to Ruby ranged from practical to whimsical, each chosen to encourage her curiosity and creativity rather than conformity to others' expectations. The phone call came during dinner, Ruby chattering about her day while Cole served homemade soup, and Grace listened with the patient attention she'd learned to give to 8-year-old observations about playground politics and cafeteria mysteries. Charles's voice sounded older over the connection, wearier than Grace remembered, stripped of the commanding authority that had once defined their every interaction. He was calling from a hospital room in Manhattan, surrounded by machines that monitored the heart attack that had finally forced him to confront his own mortality. The conversation was brief and painful, apologies offered too late, and forgiveness requested without the humility to truly earn it. Grace listened to the man who'd shaped her early life attempt to build bridges he'd spent decades burning, his fear of dying alone finally outweighing his pride in dying successful. Grace's decision surprised even herself. She would visit Charles in New York, not to reconcile, but to find closure, to face the ghost of her corporate past with the confidence of someone who'd chosen love over legacy. Cole understood without explanation, his kiss goodbye carrying support rather than concern. Trust that Grace's heart belonged to their small Oregon home, regardless of where business might temporarily take her. Ruby insisted on packing a care package for the sick grandpa she'd never met, her innocent compassion a reminder that children see possibilities where adults see only problems. The flight to New York felt like traveling backward through time, each mile carrying Grace further from the life she'd built and closer to the person she'd once been forced to become. Charles looked smaller in his hospital bed, diminished by illness and the recognition that money couldn't purchase immortality or genuine human connection. Their conversation lasted 3 hours, spanning decades of misunderstandings and missed opportunities, control disguised as love and rebellion mistaken for ingratitude. Grace finally understood that Charles had adopted her not as a daughter, but as a project, grooming her to carry forward his empire because he couldn't bear the thought of his life's work dying with him. His fear of irrelevance had created the very isolation he'd spent his final years trying to escape. When Grace described her current life, the small house, the modest business, the found family that filled her days with purpose and joy, Charles listened with the attention of someone trying to comprehend a language he'd never learned to speak. The funeral 3 weeks later was attended by hundreds of people, whose names appeared in business magazines and whose companies shaped global markets. Grace sat in the back row, listening to eulogies that praised Charles's business acumen and philanthropic contributions, without mentioning his capacity for love or his ability to find joy in simple pleasures. She'd inherited nothing material from the man who'd raised her, but his death had given her something more valuable: the certain knowledge that success without connection was just elaborate loneliness, that building empires meant nothing if you had no one to share them with. The flight home to Oregon felt like returning to herself, each mile carrying her closer to the people who loved her, not for what she could achieve, but for who she chose to be. Spring brought new projects and familiar rhythms, the community center design that would bear Thomas Bennett's name in quiet recognition of the man who'd saved Grace's life and inadvertently created their family's foundation. Ruby had grown taller over the winter, her questions more sophisticated, but her wonder intact, her presence a daily reminder that the future belonged to those brave enough to imagine it differently. Cole's hand had healed completely, his fingers once again able to create beautiful things from raw materials and patient vision. Their love had deepened through seasons of change and challenge, proving that families could be built from choice rather than chance, commitment rather than convenience. Grace woke each morning grateful for the accident of kindness that had brought them together, the divine comedy of errors that had led her home to herself. The small wooden elephant sat on Ruby's nightstand now, its surface polished smooth by young hands that traced its curves while listening to bedtime stories about grandfathers and grandmothers she'd never met, but whose love lived on in family traditions and shared memories. Grace and Cole had decided to expand their family, not through biology but through adoption, offering a home to children who needed second chances and unconditional love. Their house was already full of laughter and chaos and the beautiful mess of lives intertwined by choice rather than obligation. Success, Grace had learned, wasn't measured in stock prices or market share, but in moments of connection, in the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful, in the certain knowledge that love multiplied rather than divided when shared freely and without condition. The innocent observation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither adult was quite ready to address directly. But as they stood together in that tournament hall, surrounded by chessboards and the echoes of a hard-fought victory, Madison Clark and David Miller both realized that some games change everyone who plays them, and that the most important victories are often the ones that nobody keeps score of. 6 months after David Miller's tournament victory, Madison Clark found herself in an unfamiliar position, sitting in the bleachers of Riverside Elementary School's multipurpose room, watching Emma perform in the third-grade spring concert while trying to process how completely her life had changed since that first chess game at the community center. David sat beside her, wearing the same flannel shirt he had worn to their first meeting, though now it was by choice rather than necessity. His tournament winnings and subsequent sponsorship deals had provided financial stability, but he had chosen to maintain the simple lifestyle that had sustained him and Emma through their most difficult years. Success, he had learned, was about having enough rather than having everything. Emma's clear soprano voice carried across the room as she sang her solo in Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and Madison felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Watching this confident, joyful child perform with such natural grace, it was hard to imagine the scared little girl who had spent weeks in the hospital, or the father who had sat vigil beside her bed while his world crumbled around him. "She's incredible," Madison whispered, not trusting her voice to remain steady at normal volume. David nodded, his eyes never leaving Emma as she moved through the choreography with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only children possess. "Sarah always said Emma would be a performer," he said quietly. "She used to sing lullabies that could make Emma stop crying instantly, even when she was a baby. It was the first time in months that David had mentioned his late wife, without the shadow of pain that usually accompanied such references, and Madison realized that somewhere in their journey together, he had found a way to honor Sarah's memory without being imprisoned by it. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed from a weight that held him down into something more like a compass that pointed him toward what mattered most. The concert concluded with all the children singing together, their voices blending in the kind of imperfect harmony that parents find more beautiful than any professional performance. As the audience applauded and families began gathering their children, Madison became aware of the other parents glancing in their direction with curious expressions. She and David had become something of a local celebrity couple, though neither of them was entirely comfortable with the attention. The chess world had embraced David's comeback story with enthusiasm, and Madison's role as his sponsor and partner had generated its own media interest. Several magazines had run features about their relationship, though they had been careful to keep the focus on David's professional achievements rather than their personal lives. "Daddy! Madison!" Emma ran toward them with the breathless excitement of a performer who had just conquered the world. Her costume, a sparkly blue dress that she had helped choose, caught the gymnasium lights as she moved, making her look like a small star who had temporarily descended to earth. David scooped her up in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "You were amazing, sweetheart. That solo was perfect." Emma beamed at the praise, then turned to Madison with an expression that had become familiar over the past months, the look of a child who had claimed an additional adult as family. "Did you hear me sing the rainbow song? I thought about Mommy when I sang it, because Daddy says she's somewhere over the rainbow now." Madison felt tears threaten at the casual way Emma had learned to integrate her mother's memory into her daily life, turning loss into something that enhanced rather than diminished her joy. "I heard every note," Madison said. "Your Mommy would be so proud of you." As they prepared to leave the school, several other parents approached with congratulations about Emma's performance and questions about David's next tournament schedule. Madison watched him handle the attention with the kind of gracious professionalism he had developed since returning to competitive play, but she could see the slight tension in his posture that suggested he was still adjusting to being a public figure again. The drive home took them through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, past the community center where they had first met, and the elementary school where David still occasionally worked as a substitute teacher. Emma chatted from the back seat about her classmates' performances and her plans for summer vacation, her voice providing a cheerful soundtrack to the comfortable silence between the adults. "I've been thinking," David said as they pulled into Madison's driveway, a ritual that had developed over months of shared dinners and homework supervision and chess lessons. About what comes next. Madison felt her stomach flutter with anticipation mixed with anxiety. They had been carefully avoiding conversations about the future, focusing instead on the day-to-day reality of building something neither of them had expected to find. "What kind of thinking?" David turned off the engine and looked at her with the same focused intensity he brought to critical chess positions. "I've been offered a spot in the U.S. Championship qualifying cycle. It would mean more travel, higher stakes, the kind of pressure I walked away from 5 years ago." Emma had gone quiet in the back seat, and Madison realized that she was listening to the conversation with the sharp attention of a child who understood that adult decisions could change everything about her world. "And?" Madison prompted, though she thought she could guess the direction of his thoughts. "And I keep thinking about what you said at the hospital, about helping Emma know that her father is a hero. I want her to see that choosing love doesn't mean giving up on excellence, that you can honor the people you've lost by becoming the best version of yourself." Madison nodded, understanding both the ambition and the fear in his voice. "But," David smiled, the expression carrying all the wisdom he had gained from loss and recovery and learning to hope again. but I also want her to know that the most important victories happen when the people you love are there to share them with you. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward between their seats. Daddy, are you asking Madison to marry you? Because if you are, you're supposed to ask me first if it's okay, and then you have to give her a ring. The directness of the question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Madison's heart race and David's face flush with embarrassment. They had been moving toward this conversation for months, but Emma's innocent intervention had accelerated the timeline considerably. Actually, David said, reaching into his jacket pocket with the kind of careful movement that suggested he had been planning this moment. I was getting to that part. He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple diamond ring that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the car windows. Madison Clark, he said, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence he had shown during their first chess game. You taught me that it's possible to build something new from the pieces of what you've lost. Will you marry me and help me teach Emma that love is the only game worth winning? Madison stared at the ring, processing the magnitude of what David was offering. Not just marriage, but partnership in raising Emma, integration into a family that had learned to find joy after devastating loss, the chance to build a life based on love rather than achievement. Yes, she said, surprising herself with how quickly and certainly the word came. Yes, of course. Yes. As David slipped the ring onto her finger and Emma cheered from the back seat, Madison realized that she had finally found the victory that mattered most, not defeating opponents or accumulating wealth or proving her superiority, but joining a family that had taught her the difference between winning and being happy. Emma's voice interrupted her thoughts. Does this mean I get to call you Mom now? Because I've been practicing, and I think you'd like it. Madison looked at this extraordinary child who had somehow claimed her heart as completely as her father had, and realized that some games truly do change everyone who plays them, and that the best victories are the ones where everybody wins. I would love that more than anything in the world, Madison said, pulling Emma into a hug that felt like coming home. As they sat together in the car, three people who had found each other across circumstances that should have kept them apart, David Miller reflected on the strange mathematics of love, how losing everything had somehow led him to gain more than he had ever dared to hope for. But Emma, with the wisdom that children sometimes possess about the most important things, had the final word. I knew you were going to be my mum from the very first day we met you. Daddy just took a long time to figure it out because grown-ups are sometimes slow about the obvious stuff. And as they laughed together in the fading afternoon light, Madison Clark and David Miller both understood that their greatest victory had nothing to do with chess and everything to do with learning that the best moves in life are the ones that bring people together rather than defeat them. Some games, after all, are won not by checkmate, but by finding the courage to say yes to love when it appears in the most unexpected places, even if it comes disguised as a challenge from a CEO who thought she knew everything about winning, and a single father who taught her what it really means to play for keeps.